All right, hello everyone. Thanks for coming tonight. I'm Dr. Elena Traster in the Environmental Studies Department here at MCLA. Welcome to our Green Living Seminar presentation tonight. This presentation is part of our Spring 2025 Rewilding Our World series, and this and all of these presentations are free and open to the public. They take place here in the Feigenbaum Center for Science and Innovation, room 121, on Wednesdays at 5:30. If you want to look at the schedule of upcoming presentations, that is online at www.mcla.edu/greenliving, one word. And so before I introduce our speaker tonight, just a quick invitation for you to come back again next week and join us on February 12th. Dr. Paula Prist is the Senior Program Coordinator with Forest and Grasslands Unit of the IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature. She'll be presenting a lecture on restoring forests to reduce the spread of disease. Today's presentation will last for about 45 minutes, and there will be a Q&A session at the end, so ask lots of questions at the end. It's titled, The Role of Tree Species Selection in Managing Sustainable Urban Forests. It's going to be given by Sarah Greenleaf. She works as an urban forester with the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation. After completing a graduate program in urban forestry at Oregon State University, she returned to Massachusetts, where she joined the Greening the Gateway Cities program, an initiative that promotes urban forest equity and environmental justice through tree planting. We're really glad you joined us. Thanks so much.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. So as Elena mentioned, my name is Sarah, and I'm an urban forester with the DCR in Mass. And I'm excited to be here tonight to talk about kind of a different and unique type of rewilding, and that's urban forestry. And as the name kind of suggests, it is the care and management of trees in cities. But it also extends to other communities, towns and suburbs. So it's really communities of people and the trees that are among them. So I'm going to chat just a little bit about my tree planting program that I work with, and then I'm going to, most of the presentation will be about talking about tree species selection. So the, as I just mentioned, kind of got a half and half, dividing the presentation here. I'll chat about what is a gateway city. People are always curious about that, of course, and how our program works, how we reach out to folks to get them interested in the program. And then I'm going to talk about tree species selection, look at what makes planting in the urban environment so unique and often challenging. I'll look at sustainable urban forestry, and then we'll do a couple examples of trees that we plant in our program and kind of looking at them through a lens of native versus non-native trees. So the Greening the Gateway Cities tree planting program is, it's part of the Department of Conservation and Rec, and it's funded by the Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, and it is a free tree planting program. It's located across the state, and we're in 23 cities, and our goal is to basically increase urban canopy so that we can provide shade and important cooling, and also provide energy reduction as well, or energy consumption reduction. So savings benefits. And we work on public, private property, pretty much anywhere in our planting zones. We're trying to plant trees. So this is where we're distributed across the state. So these are gateway cities, and my next slide will go into what that is. But my region, I work in Westfield, Holyoke, and Chicopee. So I came from the Westfield office, which is like a little over an hour away. And then we also have a different program in Springfield as well. We started 10 years ago. We started in 3 cities, and one of them was Holyoke, where I work. We've slowly added all the cities as we've gotten more funding for the program, and we're 3 cities away from being in all 26 gateway cities. So what is a gateway city? So these are mid-sized industrial cities that once offered residents a gateway to the American dream. So that's kind of how the term is coined. And so these cities they once had bustling industrial economies. There were a lot of manufacturing jobs, a lot of mill industry, And these were well-populated areas. And each of the gateway cities, they had their own claim to fame. So these are some of the cities that we work in. And Springfield had the first US armory. It also had one of the first large-scale weapons manufacturers. Holyoke is still known as Paper City. In 1920, it was providing the majority of the country with its writing paper. It was also the first planned industrial city in the country. So that means as they were developing and laying out the city, they did so with the intention to support that mill industry. So it's right next to the Connecticut River. So of course they built a canal system for that hydropower. And then Chicopee had lots of textile manufacturing, and Johnson & Johnson was there at one point. So the quality of life is good in these cities. And this is a snapshot of just a downtown intersection in Holyoke where I work. And this is 1941. And then we fast forward to 2024, and this is the same intersection. So it's High Street and Appleton Street, if you're familiar with the area. And I noticed that there are much fewer people, and then also definitely fewer businesses as well. So what happened is these mill towns and these industry cities, they started to become deindustrialized. So the mill industry basically started to collapse and jobs started to disappear. And because of this, people started to move out of town. And then when that happens with population loss, that results in economic loss as well. So you had these once really bustling economies, the industry kind of went down the drain, people moved out, and now you have these cities that are facing some economic struggles, but they still have that mill kind of interesting industrial complex like infrastructure present in the cities, which you're always kind of reminded of as you are in those downtown areas. The state defines a gateway city using these three demographics. So again, it's the mid-sized city, so between 35 and 250,000. And they also have a below average median household income, as well as below average rate of educational attainment. And okay, so we work in gateway cities. Within each city, we work in environmental justice neighborhoods. So environmental justice, or EJ as we call it, this is the concept that all people, regardless of race, ethnicity, education, salary, deserve equitable access to environmental benefits and environmental protections. So the different colors on the map show different demographics. So we have, they represent minority populations where the income is lower than the state average. And also it's called English isolation. This is when English is not the primary language spoken in the household. And then characteristics that we also find in these environmental justice populations are lower tree canopy, which makes sense, we're there to plant trees. And then also, these neighborhoods often have older housing stock and higher wind speeds, which is definitely problematic if we're thinking about energy consumption in the winter, heating your house and having that heat just kind of go out of those poorly insulated buildings. And these neighborhoods also have higher renter populations as opposed to home ownership. So, so that's the community that we are serving and how we work. So we have a variety of outreach methods. The crew will go out and do door knocking and do canvassing and just kind of say, hey, I planted a tree at your neighbor's house last year, would you like one? And we do mailings, and we've even had billboards in the past. We always work closely with our municipal partners and get their endorsement. And so, sometimes the mayor, like the Holyoke mayor, did a Facebook post for my program last season, and it was a really great means of outreach. So however people hear about it, they then go onto our webpage, maurbancanopy.org, or they give us a call, and at that point, we'll schedule that initial site visit. And so that's when a forester, like myself, will come to the property. And again, these are anywhere in a project area. So someone's house, even if you're a renter, you're eligible, you just have to have the homeowner's permission. Businesses, or if we're working with a municipal partner, a park or a tree belt. So we come to the property and I chat with the folks, the residents, what are you interested in? where do you want trees? Are you looking for some maybe additional shade on the west side of your house to help with the summer sun? Or are you, looking for a little bit more privacy on this side of the house? Trees provide so many utilities, especially around residences. And then I basically come in and say, all right, well, these are the kind of tree species that would just do super well in this instance. And so it's a combination of they get to choose species and I direct the species that will perform the best. So this is an example of, this is a site visit form or map. And this was just this is an apartment complex in downtown Springfield. And each of those green bubbles is just a different tree species that we agreed upon. And then after that, our crews will do the planting. We have a couple different nursery contracts across the state. And this is a picture of this is my yard at Hampton Pond State Park in Westfield, where my office is. So we get these tree deliveries maybe once a week, every other week, and we water the trees and then we bring them out into the field. And we plant the trees. We have a spring and a fall planting season, so 12 weeks each. And then after the tree planting, it's up to the residents to take care of the trees, water them, and maintain them. So if we plant the trees on public property, so again, a park or like a tree pit or a tree belt on the sidewalk, either my program or the municipality will assume maintenance responsibility. Normally it's my program. But if it's a residential property, then we have people actually sign a little contract saying, I will water each tree 15 gallons once a week for the first 2 years of establishment. The 2 years right after planting, that's kind of your a little bit more delicate establishment phase where the roots need that supplemental watering as they're kind of setting out on their own. And then we don't have an automatic follow-up of every single tree we plant because we plant tens of thousands of trees, but we're always just trying to say, like, here's my cell phone number, give me a call, even if it's 4 years after I planted your tree, we want to know if something's up with the tree. So to date, our program has planted almost 46,000 trees, which is really exciting. And again, that's over the last 10 years in 23 cities. In Western Mass, where my program is, specifically, we've planted about 11,660. Last year was really important because we received some additional funding, and this basically allowed us to expand our project zones. So in the red rectangle in the center, that is Chicopee. That's a neighborhood in Chicopee called Willimantic. And before 2024, that was the entirety of my project area. And each dot is a tree that we planted. Each color is a different year that we planted it in. So that's our tree planting map. Now over here, this blue map this blue zone is the area that is the environmental justice population as defined by the state. So this expansion allowed us to enter the entirety of the EJ zones. So we went from just serving this one neighborhood to the entirety of what are considered the most vulnerable populations in the state. All right, so a little background of who we are and how we work. And now I just want to talk about the trees, which I think is really the funnest part. So before we talk about trees, though, in urban forestry, you really got to set the scene because planting in the urban environment has a very unique set of challenges and barriers that ultimately determine the kind of tree species that are going to thrive and do well. So these are honestly just some of the issues that we encounter. So limited root volume is number one, I would say. You can see here you've got a big old tree in a tiny little spot. So you probably understand that most trees are not going to be happy in this scenario. Very simply put, if a tree cannot expand its roots and therefore gather enough resources to feed its canopy, it's not going to have a good looking canopy or be able to thrive. The next big problem we deal with is root compaction. So this is basically when there is, some kind of impact on top of the root zone. So anywhere outside of where the roots are supposed to be. And the issue with this is, well, I mean, physical damage can be done to the roots, which is problematic, but the kind of bigger issue is the soil compaction that's happening. And this can be done by as simple as just pedestrian foot traffic, of course, vehicles or construction activities, any kind of impact that's putting pressure on that root zone. This basically squeezes out that important pore space that's in the soil structure. And that pore space is important for air and water. And so as it's compacted, the roots are left with this pretty uninhabitable, dry, hard-packed environment that they're not going to want to spread their roots into. So that is obviously a direct impact on the ability of trees to thrive. So we are in the cities. There are so many conflicts with the urban infrastructure we have to think about when planting trees. And I'll go into some more of those in the next slide. But space is definitely at a premium in cities. And you can see in this photo, there's pretty much no planting space. You've got building, sidewalk, road, building. And so the city, they had to get creative and they made this little tree pit. And then in instances like this, where we're really, limited, because that building is right there, you're not going to want to put a huge canopy tree there. We get to employ creative solutions. So this is an English oak, but it's a specific cultivar that is a columnar variety, so it stays narrow. It'll get a little wider than that as it gets taller, but it's not going to be an issue with maintenance bumping up against that building. So the urban heat island effect, I'm sure everyone has heard of this. So this is basically the explanation as to why cities are hotter than outlying suburban and rural areas. And, so essentially we've got the sun is just beating down on all your impervious surface, so surface that water is not able to penetrate. You've got, parking lots and buildings and roadways, and these are absorbing the heat all day and then also reflecting it during the day and into the night. And so that creates an up to 8-degree differential, so 8 degrees hotter than the nearby rural area. And definitely climate change is only serving to exacerbate the urban heat island effect. So then we get into summer months, it's July and August, and then you get these pretty intense heat spikes in the downtown area, especially if there's no shade and no trees. And these heat spikes can be really stressful for a lot of tree species. Some, and we'll talk about those, some can handle it, but most are going to experience some kind of stress in that really hot situation. Obviously, air pollution is a thing in cities, and we have to choose tree species that have some kind of tolerance to air pollution. But we also think a lot about the pollution on the ground. So in the winter, you've got road salts being applied to the ground, and those are going to basically enter the side of the road and leach into a tree's root zone. And that can obviously be very detrimental for certain trees. Again, some trees are a little more tolerant. They can kind of handle that road salt situation. A lot can't. And then lastly, conflicts with social activities. So conflicts or interactions. So you're in a city, there's constantly people around the trees. And it can be positive. People can be appreciating the trees or caring for them, but it can often be negative. More often, you'd be surprised that trees get vandalized for whatever reason. I kid you not, often I will just see a tree broken in half that was only planted recently. So stuff like that happens, a car door opening up into a tree or a vehicular accident or of course construction and development. Life is always happening around these trees. They have a lot to contend with in cities. So continuing talking about the challenges of planting in the urban environment, I want to introduce the concept of right tree, right place. And this is basically the foundation of urban forestry. It's what helps us urban foresters choose the correct tree to plant in what location, because there's a lot of factors that will affect the tree's ability to thrive. So I mentioned species tolerances on the last slide. So some trees, they can handle, maybe a little bit more salt or root compaction, and some really can't. So just like people, each tree species has their own character profile. They have their set of preferences. So Some trees they can grow happily in the shade, and some are just intolerant of the shade. Some can handle kind of long periods of drought, which is obviously good for urban areas, and some can't handle a week of it. So you gotta know your species, you gotta know the right tree to site. And then right place. So urban infrastructure is something we have to work with and around when planning for tree planting, especially when we're thinking about how big is this tree gonna be in 30, 40 years. They maybe weren't thinking about that when they planted this giant oak tree under these high voltage power lines. So this was definitely the wrong tree. This down here is, I would say, the right tree. This is a city sprite zelkova. That's a small selection of a zelkova tree that tops out around like 25, 30 feet. It's not going to interfere with those high voltage power lines. We have to deal with other urban infrastructure that we can't see, and so that's underground utilities. This is a tree pit in Westfield that I was hoping to plant, but after I called DigSafe, and they contacted the local utilities, they were able to mark the utilities, and I was surprised to see there's electric lines, that's the E, running right under the tree pit. So that's a big conflict there and a safety hazard. And then, especially in your dense, highly populated areas, there's just a lot of other elements of the urban infrastructure that we have to think about: stop signs, intersections, driveways, fire hydrants. And we have a set of standards in our program that tells us, well, it's got to be X number of feet away from these objects. So if you plant an elm tree, for example, 10 feet away from a stop sign, that's going to be problematic kind of in the near future, because first of all, they grow so fast and huge, they're going to kind of engulf the stop sign. You won't be able to see it. There's going to be issues, some visibility concerns there. So again, it's just thinking about the right place and the right tree species that's going to perform well. And then there is an ideal urban tree to plant in cities. And I don't mean species, I mean just like set of characteristics. And so the ideal urban tree, it has a high canopy. So there are some species that tend to get multi-stem or bushy or really sucker a lot at the base when they're sending up those sprouts. Not ideal for cities. You want your tree species selection to be relatively low maintenance, especially considering that we're working in gateway cities. So these are areas where the governments are under a little bit of economic strain. So they may not have the overhead, the resources to adequately maintain their trees, and even as simple as just leaf pickup in the fall. So it's our job to plant as low maintenance trees as possible, ones that are not very disease prone, ones that are not dropping huge fruits and spiky seed balls, ones that maybe have smaller leaves that can be a little bit more manageable during fall collection. All right, so now we're going to pivot and talk about sustainable urban forestry. And here's a few concepts I want to just discuss that kind of set a good context for that. So biodiversity is short for biological diversity, and that is very simply the variety of all living things and the interactions between them. So you have different levels of biodiversity. You can find that within species or within genetics or within an entire ecosystem. And a very important example of biodiversity in urban forestry is tree species diversity. So a healthy, strong urban forest is one that has a lot of different types of tree species. And in order to kind of illustrate that, I'll just give you the classic example of early 1900s, turn of the century. You had so many neighborhoods that in the United States that were lined with American elms. Awesome urban tree, thrives, does so well. And so just, every block just lined with those beautiful elms. Along comes Dutch elm disease. And in a very kind of quick amount of time, you go from having these full canopies to no trees at all. And so if there were some more species that had been planted, there would have been a little bit of urban forest left over after the Dutch elm disease came. And this is because not all, but many pests and pathogens are species specific, so they really only want one host plant. So it's up to us as land managers and urban foresters to plant a variety of hosts to kind of dampen the effect of any potential pest invasion. So tree species diversity is always at the top of any urban forest management plan because that adds a natural resilience against pests and pathogens. Ecosystem services are any positive benefit that people get from wildlife or ecosystems. And there's a whole bunch of ways to think about these ecosystem services and how they're grouped. I wanted to, of course, highlight the services that trees provide because they certainly play a role. And remember, we think of trees, and you got your canopy, you got your stem, but they also have these incredible networks of root systems. And those really come into play with stormwater management and helping with erosion control. Of course, trees are great at purifying the air. They can regulate and reduce temperature. Trees are great at sequestering and storing carbon, as well as providing wildlife habitat and food. So a sustainable urban forest can be thought of in three simple components. You have your vegetation resource. You have a strong community framework. And then you also have an appropriate management of that resource. So example being trees. You got your trees. They need to be the right trees and also healthy trees to sustain the urban forest. And then you need not just government support, but you also need community down to individual people in neighborhoods. You need their buy-in and support and investment. And then you also need a good management plan. You've got to be planning for the care of all the current trees in the ground so that they can live as long and productive lives as possible. Also, any urban forestry plan has to constantly be thinking about planting the next generation, because trees, they age out or they become hazardous and they have to get removed. So in order to sustain the resource, you've got to be always planting that next age class. You can also think of a sustainable urban forest in what it does. And again, thinking back to that last slide, ecosystem services. So those basically define sustainability in an urban forest. So a sustainable urban forest advances human health. It provides economic development and social equity. It can, of course, provide important habitat and food for wildlife. Also does a great job at regulating the quality of air and water, among other benefits. As I was mentioning to Elena, I really like urban forestry because it's a cool union of two disciplines. So you have physical science meets social science. So in urban forestry, you got to understand trees. You got to understand their biology and physiology, risk assessment, all that. But you also have to understand people and society and how they work, because it's really a very complex relationship between the two. So a sustainable urban forest is a collaboration of forest productivity and societal demands, essentially. And what that all boils down to, if it's being run efficiently, is healthy trees and happy people. All right, I'm sure most of you are familiar with these terms, but just wanted to lay them out before we proceed. So a couple examples of native, non-native, and invasive. You have your classic sugar maple, classic New England native tree, so also referred to as indigenous. These are trees that naturally occur in a specific region without human intervention. And then we have a ginkgo biloba, also called maidenhair tree. And this is an example of a non-native, also referred to as exotic or alien. And these are trees that don't naturally exist in a certain region, and they are introduced by human activity. So ginkgo does really well in New England, but it's non-native because it's from China originally. And then you have where we start to get into problems is invasive. This is when you have non-native plants that start to present harm economically, environmentally, even to human health. There's a further definition actually, which is noxious weed, and that's when basically some authoritative body has come in to regulate that tree species to basically say, this, you cannot plant this. So tree of heaven, I don't know if you all are familiar with that. That is a really problematic tree, not just in the urban landscape, but it is non-native, it's invasive. It basically it grows so quickly and aggressively that it outcompetes other vegetation that you would like to keep. So this is where our program stands as far as what we plant in our urban tree planting program. So this is a summary of our native versus non-native tree species over the last 10 years in all 23 cities. So on your left, that's your non-native, and then the two colors on the right are your native plants. So we're about half and half. So you may be wondering, why are there two slices to the pie on the native side? So that's because we use the distinction nativar. So when we're defining tree species, you've got your genus, you've got your species. We call that a straight species. In horticulture and in urban forestry, there's often a third qualifier. So that could be a cultivar or a variety or a hybrid. There's more. And so that's when there's some distinct trait of that species. Perhaps it's a variegated leaf color, or bigger flowers, or a longer bloom season, or in the case of an earlier slide, I showed that very narrow English oak tree. So those are all specific traits that just happen randomly, a genetic mutation essentially, and those are then cultivated for production essentially. So you've got a native tree that has a cultivar attached to it is considered a nativar. So you might think, well, why do we have to distinguish? They're all native. It is important to distinguish the two because there is growing interest and certainly research into looking at do cultivars versus straight species have any different impacts on local ecosystem? And I did read a study actually that was looking at native wildlife, how they interact with a straight species versus cultivar. And they didn't find many differences except for some of the wildlife seemed to be less inclined to interact with an altered leaf color. So there's not any huge findings at this time, but it's important data to keep track of. So it's important to plant native tree species. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention Doug Tallamy. So he is an entomologist and researcher out of Delaware. And he's really done a great job at bringing front to center the importance of planting native plants and native trees. And a lot of his research is regarding the thesis that you need native plants in order to support native wildlife. And so an example of that relationship, the native flora supporting native fauna, here's one that we have in our area, New England. This is the hairstreak butterfly that is native to our area, and then the red oak, certainly a native tree in our area. And I use oak tree because oaks they support so many butterflies and caterpillars, and they provide food and habitat for so much wildlife. So that's a very important relationship. And one of the, Doug Tallamy has written lots of books and, written a lot of papers, research papers. One of the papers he worked on was looking at, they looked at backyards in Washington, D.C., and they were looking at the effect of native plants on chickadees, which is a native bird. And they found that when there's 70% or less native plants present in the backyard, they actually saw a decline in survival of baby chickadees. So there's that direct relationship between native plants supporting native fauna. And then biodiversity, a lot of research shows that the presence of native plants does wonders in supporting biodiversity and creating biodiversity. I also included natural heritage as a reason that native tree species are important, because I think it's definitely important to people. You know, if you want to celebrate the identity of a local town or region, you'd probably be more inclined to plant native plant species, because those share an evolutionary history with the other animal and wild plant species in that area. So it's almost a little bit of loyalty to the identity of certain regions. So I'd love to plant all native species in the city, but we can't, because there are a lot of challenges that prevent that from happening. So, and again, remember, we are explicitly in the context of planting in the urban environment and thinking about all those challenges that we talked about on the earlier slides. So one of the issues that we're running into, of course, climate change comes into pretty much every natural resource conversation. So the native range for species are being affected. So this is basically, this is where a tree species naturally grows without human intervention. And this map shows all these different colors are different forest types. So like the red is maple beech birch, you've got oak hickory. This model, this map is run through a climate change model and projected 100 years out. And this shows how those natural native ranges shift. The first thing I notice is that there's fewer colors. The purple is gone, and you can definitely see a change. So this is all to say that just because a plant is native to Massachusetts doesn't necessarily mean it's the best choice to plant in a Massachusetts city, because we have to think about how it's going to thrive in 50 to 100 years, because we want to be practicing sustainable urban forestry, trees that are going to live for a while. And depending on the species tolerances, it may not be able to handle those rising temperatures. So this is something that we're just kind of having to look at a little bit more critically now. So the urban environment, cities, they are such highly altered environments. The soil is not reminiscent of the native soil that once used to be there. All the construction and development just changes, the makeup, the biological makeup of a city. So essentially, after all of your development and construction, you're left with an area that is not reflective of those prior native conditions. You have a novel environment, and that's its own area of study now, which is basically these human-made environments, essentially, where non-native species do play important roles in those. So again, that's to say that, just thinking about a native tree native to Massachusetts doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be able to perform well in a city, because that's really not a native environment anymore. It's novel. And then, as we mentioned, biodiversity is super important for healthy forests. And in urban forestry management, we always have to be planning to have that diverse tree species representation. Because of that, we are sometimes limited in the amount of natives we can choose. So I'll just start by so this is red maple, classic New England tree, and it is really one of the best urban trees. It is so tolerant, so urban hardy, and very resilient, and obviously very beautiful in the fall. I should have picked a foliage tree, but photo. But the problem is that because it's so loved and so and performs so well in the city, it is severely overplanted. So in fact, it is it's definitely one of the most overplanted tree species in most cities in the state. And so the cities that I work on, they actually have said, don't plant red maples on public property, because they're really trying to bring those numbers down to try to increase that diversity. So red maple's off the table, unfortunately. We do plant a few on private properties, kind of on a limited basis. And then here's a great native tree. This is called the cockspur hawthorn. And I'm showing this because There's often in my position, I will sometimes be tasked with siting trees in a city block. You know, say the city comes to me and they say, we want you to plant trees in this 5 blocks of sidewalk here. You've got kind of small tree pits. This is downtown urban area, tough urban conditions, and there's high voltage power lines running overhead. So I think, okay, I know that cockspur hawthorn is going to be an option, a good option, because it's very urban tolerant. It can handle that compact soil and limited root volume. It's a native tree, which is awesome. Plant native when you can. It's a smaller tree. It's not going to grow tall enough to interfere with those overhead high voltage lines. And bonus, it's flowering. It's really beautiful and ornamental. So the issue is that's really one of the only trees that checks all those boxes so neatly. There are a few other urban trees like chokecherry and serviceberry that are smaller trees, but are arguably not quite as urban tolerant, and that might not perform as well in that kind of harsh downtown setting. So I can't plant all cockspur hawthorns down these 5 blocks because that would go against our biodiversity requirements. So because of that, I'm forced to look into other species, which often are non-native. All right, so some species highlights. This is one of my favorite native shade trees that we plant. This is the common hackberry, and it's a relatively fast-growing, long-lived, large shade tree. And these are very tolerant. I've had great success planting these in tree pits in downtown Holyoke with limited root volume. You can see they can handle that limited root volume with this tree belt. They're performing just fine. And it's got really cool bark. It's very corky and kind of soft and spongy to the touch. And it's a very low maintenance tree, I would say. It's got medium-sized leaves. It's not dropping tons of seeds. It does have fruit. I don't know if you can see those tiny little dark berries. They're edible to us and also edible to wildlife. Usually the wildlife ends up snatching them before they make a mess on the ground. And a pretty decent fall color as well. So that's definitely a go-to in my program. Here's another plant we plant. So this is the serviceberry, and it's actually one of the smaller trees smallest trees we plant in the program. It's hovering around the 15 to 20 foot range, and obviously we want to plant big trees because we want to increase that urban canopy to get those benefits. But urban forestry, you've got all kinds of different situations and restrictions, so sometimes you need a small tree. So serviceberry has a few different species, and this is, by the way, it has a bunch of common names. It also has shadblow and shadberry and juneberry, you may have heard it as. So this is Amelanchier levis, and this has more of your single upright stem. Obviously, it takes up a little less room and is good for your planting scenarios where you're close to a building or a walkway. This is Amelanchier grandifolia, and this is a multi-stem option, so it's a bit more shrubby, more appropriate for a park setting. Serviceberries have awesome red fall foliage. In the fall, when I have all my trees delivered and I've got all my trees in the yard, serviceberry really stands out as far as its fall foliage. Beautiful spring blossoms, and then also edible berries, edible to us and to wildlife. When I'm on site visits and people are saying, oh, I love birds, I'd love to plant trees to bring the birds to my backyard, I will definitely suggest plant a serviceberry. I will also suggest plant a black gum. So similar to serviceberry, they have these tiny little blue fruits, edible to us and to wildlife. This is a larger tree than serviceberry, but actually smaller than hackberry. It's kind of your medium size in the 40 to 50 foot range. A little bit more slow growing. And one of the reasons I love this tree is that it has ornamental value throughout the seasons, in my opinion. So this is kind of chronological through the seasons. So springtime, your black gum also is referred to as a tupelo, in case you've heard it called that. So this is the new growth coming off at the end of the stems. This is the tip growth. These are bright red and orange leaves. So you've got a pop of color even well before fall. Black gums have a really nice, full, dense canopy, so they're very good at providing shade, which is our primary goal. And then in the fall, you can see why I often suggest this as an alternative to planting the red maple. So this is, I couldn't pick just one oak tree because there's so many to celebrate. And as far as native plants go, as I mentioned, they provide so much habitat and food and resources to wildlife. So I will just highlight two. This is the swamp white oak. It does well with limited root volume. You can see that it's just growing in a tree pit here. Also has this interesting characteristic, which it has pubescence on the underside of the leaf, so that's basically hairs. And they're essentially helping to filter out the particulate matter in the air, so they're good at cleaning the air, essentially. And then pin oak is probably going to be your most common oak tree you come across in an urban environment. It's got a little bit more of a narrow form than the others, and it has just your very dependable, beautiful, symmetrical form. And then we get to planting non-native species. So biggest reason we plant them is because, as I said, not all native trees are urban tolerant. We demand urban tolerance in tree planting in the city, so we resort to non-natives. Here's an example of one. This is the Japanese pagoda, and this is New York City. They do super well in a downtown scenario, and these have excellent heat tolerance, so they're going to really be with us throughout climate change. There is research that shows that non-native trees can contribute to biodiversity and ecosystem services. This is not to say that we should plant non-natives instead of natives. Natives are the powerhouse of providing these a sustainable urban forest as far as if you want that biodiversity and ecosystem services. But the point is to say that non-native plants do play a role in a productive urban forest. So one of the studies I read basically looked at, in Geneva, Switzerland, the effect of the quality and quantity of ecosystem services and how they were impacted by native versus non-native plants, and they didn't find a difference between the two. So challenges, of course, I'll just skip to the biggest one is the invasive potential. So I have shown the three, I would say, very popular urban trees that you would see that are actually invasive. And these first two are actually, as you can see, intentionally planted. So this is the Bradford pear. Maybe you are familiar with this. It's a great urban tree, very tolerant, obviously very beautiful, does not smell great. I don't know if you've ever smelled them in the spring. But they just made their way onto the invasive species list in the fall. So they're a regulated plant in the state of Massachusetts. This year more than ever, as I was driving down the highway, kind of back and forth on the pike throughout the spring, I saw just so many beautiful white blossoms in that kind of buffer between the highway and neighborhoods. And those were all Bradford pears. So that just illustrates its invasive potential. Norway maple is a classic invasive species. It does super well in urban environments, but as the name indicates, it is not from here. And it has qualities that a lot of invasive trees have, which is that it leafs out. It's one of the first trees to leaf out in the spring. So it kind of has that advantage, and it can outcompete the other vegetation. Also has a long growing season, which obviously gives it that advantage. And then lastly, this is the tree of heaven. I mentioned it earlier, but this clearly was not intentionally planted. This photo speaks for itself. The tree barely needs soil or root volume to thrive. So these, you can see the little kind of bronze seed pods. Those just spread abundantly in the urban environment. It's also particularly a problematic tree that we're thinking about now because it plays an unfortunate role in a new pest it's pretty new to Massachusetts, which is the spotted lanternfly. And the tree of heaven actually plays a role in its life cycle. So not only is it outcompeting local or more desirable plants, but it's perpetuating the life cycle of a nasty pest. Some examples of non-native but non-invasive trees that we plant. So Japanese Zelkova is definitely one of my favorite just a beautiful, nice round form. It's very low maintenance. It's just got these small leaves, basically, that you got to clean up in the fall. It has a very brilliant red color. And there's also several cultivars of it. So these are, certain characteristics that stand out. So this one, the wireless, this one is cultivated because it grows to about 20 feet. And so you can plant it under the wires, under the power lines. And these are very drought tolerant as well. Little leaf linden, so this is from Europe, and I think it's just chosen because it really has such a classic triangular kind of pyramid form. And the thing that stands out about it is definitely its beautiful fall foliage, but it has these tiny little flowers. They're not showy really, but they're so fragrant, and they do attract lots of wildlife and even some native wildlife as well. And little leaf linden is great, very tolerant with air pollution. Bald cypress is kind of a distinct tree that I love to plant in the urban environment. It is a deciduous conifer. So that means, these are actually the cones of the bald cypress, but like other deciduous trees that we've been talking about, it has a nice fall color display, and it drops its leaves. And this is important for an energy savings program because you want those trees to block the sun in the summer, drop the leaves in the winter, and let that solar warming through to the buildings. And these are incredible, they have incredible wind tolerance. So you would cite these if you have a specific wind tunnel in the urban environment. Oops. And then ginkgo, I know I mentioned it earlier. This is actually our oldest tree. Perhaps you know about the ginkgo, but it's over 200 million years old. So there's fossils of dino prints and ginkgo leaves. And it's incredibly tolerant. It's got great drought tolerance in particular, which is obviously very important for climate change. All right, so wrapping up, this is my last slide, and we've talked about scenarios where you plant natives, scenarios where you plant non-natives, and basically what it boils down to is you should choose a tree species based on how it's going to support your management goals and objectives. So any program, urban forestry, municipal program, county level, conservation program, they're going to have a set goals. And these are some of the examples of goals or objectives that a tree planting program might have. So say there's a program that really is looking to reestablish native bird populations and get pollinator populations up and really diversify tree species. You're probably going to be planting most native trees in that program. Say there's another program that's really thinking about climate change and those shifting natural ranges, native ranges, and they want to plant fast-growing, long-lived, big trees that are going to really help out with carbon storage. They're probably going to plant a mix of native and non-natives, maybe leaning towards non-natives. So really, it comes down to the different goals of the program, which are ultimately determined by the values of the community that the program is in. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much. This is our program, and if you know anyone or think you live in the planting zone or one of the planting zones in our program, please be in touch. We're always happy to plant free trees. Thank you.
We do have time for a couple questions, as promised.
Yeah.
Would you inform us a little more about storm water management?
Sure, yeah. So the root systems of trees are really important in helping basically pull up and redirect stormwater. So when storms come through, there's so much impervious surface, sidewalks and blacktop, that the water just rolls off, and that's what creates flooding. And so when you have impervious surface, so that the water can get through, and you have root systems that are actively absorbing and pulling up that water, that's basically going to take a little pressure off of the load of rainwater that comes in. So it's like an additional sponge almost, kind of in simple terms. It's just soaking up some of that rainwater and helping to redirect it. Yeah.
I was wondering where you guys get the trees from, and when planting non-native trees, if there's consideration of invasive insects or pathogens, things like that.
Yeah, so we plan. We actually have, because we're a state program, we can only work with one program nursery vendors we have on contract. So we have it's Bigelow Nurseries out in Northborough, Eastern Mass, and then also Amherst Nurseries. So they're local tree nurseries, and they grow a lot of their trees, but they also do get in a lot of their trees. So sometimes we'll find like bright red soil in a tree ball, and that's probably from Georgia. So it's a kind of a mix that we get for our stock. And then as far as invasive pests, I mean, so we definitely struggle with invasive pests with native and non-native trees. Current ones that we're really kind of thinking about are the jumping worm. I don't know if you've heard of that, but a year ago or a year and a half ago, we were really trying to just bare root and get rid of any soil of an infested tree. But it's kind of gotten to the point where jumping worms are almost everywhere now. And I mean, there is, I'll admit there's always a risk when you're planting non-native, whether it's going to be, if it does have any invasive potential, or if it does have a negative relationship with an invasive pest. But it's up to urban forest managers to plant, only trees that have been in production in the industry for a while. So we do recognize that there's a risk, and it's just about kind of being really observant and on your management. Thanks. Yeah.
Do you guys ever work with other states with like neighboring gateway cities, like New Hampshire or anything?
Awesome question. We don't actually, and to my knowledge, we're the only state planting initiative that has our model. Gateway city is specifically a term coined in Massachusetts, but you would definitely find environmental justice populations in other states. We have had kind of at the higher management levels, other states kind of inquire about our program, but pretty much because we're part of the state government, all of our activities, located in Mass. Thanks. Yeah.
When you guys plant non-native species, is there somebody who like monitors them, just to kind of keep an eye on them to make sure that they don't become invasive? And if something like that were to happen, what would you do then?
Yeah, that's a good question. So that happens more at a larger industry level, that kind of monitoring. So, as we're planting non-native plants, it's up to urban forest managers to stay very current with research. And, sometimes there will be findings that, hey, this, so for instance, golden rain tree is an urban tree you'll see in the environment that's starting to prove to be a little invasive. So it's very important to be actively seeking that education, and then you can apply those principles to your own planting program. So within kind of our small example of urban forestry, we've only been around for 10 years. So it's a little less realistic to see that trend, but again, we have to constantly stay current with research. And in the case like we recently talked about golden rain tree, it's like, okay, this is really proving to be invasive in a lot of instances. We bring it up in a staff meeting and we kind of say, let's not plant this tree anymore. So we try to stay current.
So I think we have come to 6:30, which is when we'll wrap up, but I would like to invite anyone who still has questions to stick around, because I think Sarah will stick around for a few minutes afterwards. And I also wanted to alert you to some materials that are on the front there, so take a look on your way out. Feel free, I think that those can be taken with you. So a big thank you again to Sarah for the great questions.